Hello, welcome to the fourth meeting of the Housing Our Future Task Force. I'm Katie Dunwell, Counselor Katie Dunwell, and I'm the chair of the task force. And if we want to quick do a round robin of the other members of the task force, if you can do a quick introduction, and then we can go ahead and get started. Kim, why don't you start?
Sure. Kim Reibold, Senior Planner and Project Manager for Housing Our Future for the city.
I'll go next. Carolyn Berry, City Council President.
Okay. How about we go to Commissioner Willard next?
Sorry about that. Jennifer Willard, Planning Commissioner.
All right. Lee.
Lee Crosby, Wilsonville Community Sharing Executive Director.
Eric. You're muted.
Eric Pattison, Relationship Manager at NOAA.
Maria.
Hi, everyone. Maria Vargas, I'm Director of Economic Justice at Latino Network.
I think that covers the task force. We do have Dan and Miranda with city staff.
Hey, Dan Pauly, City's Cleaning Manager.
Welcome. Rachel, the planning director.
Thanks. And Miranda, your microphone's been a little weird, just FYI. And then we've got Beth and Nicole with Echo Northwest, our project consultants. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Sure, I'm Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. I'm your project director on this. If Nicole doesn't turn on her camera, it's only because she doesn't have a lot of camera bandwidth, maybe.
Yes, I'm away on vacation at the moment, so I'm gonna keep my camera off, but I'm the project manager with Echo on this project.
Thank you. And then I see we have Andrew. Andrew, are you filling in for somebody on the task force today?
I believe so. Gloria, I'm with the Housing Authority of Clackamas County. I believe Gloria's been attending these meetings, but I'm stepping in just today. So you get me as substitute.
Excellent, and welcome to you. And then we also have Rachel with Polish Homes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rachel Vickers with Polish Homes.
Thank you. Well, I believe that covers everybody here with the task force. Councillor Dunwell, do you have any other opening remarks you'd like before we dive into the presentation?
No, I know that we've all received the information going forward in the agenda for today. Kim, I know that you're going to be driving most of the agenda, and so I'll go ahead and turn this over to you, and thank everybody for attending.
Thank you. So Beth, I'll have you go ahead and pull up the slides and do a quick little introduction. I'll provide some context, and then we'll have some discussion, much like we have in prior meetings. The goal here today is really to help us get some feedback on how we can narrow down this list of actions to provide some feedback for our city council. Their next step in this process will be to actually select the actions we want to have going forward into the housing production strategy. And so this conversation that we have will help us provide some additional context to them as they have that discussion later in February. So with that, Beth, I'll turn it over to you to start the presentation.
Okay. So just start with the overview of the agenda. So as Miranda said, most of our discussion is about refining the potential actions need to meet housing need. So discussing staff recommendations for refinement of the potential actions that'll go throughout, I think, this next hour and a half. Are there actions that are these the appropriate actions to address unmet housing need in Wilsonville? As we've discussed, housing need has multi-dimensions, ranging from housing need related to income and housing affordability to housing need related to different groups. So people with disabilities, people of different racial and ethnic groups, many other types of of experiences in life. And are there implementation considerations for the actions that we haven't included? So what we've sent you in that kind of big long memo is essentially the core of the HPS, describing, all of the actions and starting to summarize the information we know about the actions, and providing information about, okay, you say we're going to look at doing X and such. Well, what does it take from a city perspective to do X and such? What are the big steps? It's not meant to be, a comprehensive list of implementation considerations, because once you get into it, you'll find that there are things that we weren't thinking about now that you'll be thinking about then. So we want to make sure that we're not missing any big holes. And so then, as we're thinking about selecting the actions, an HPS, it has to address your 20-year housing need identified in the HNCA, which you guys may not remember the HNCA as well, but we've got all of that in mind as we go through this. And your HPS actions have to be implemented in the 6-year period of the HPS. So we need to choose actions that can, together reasonably be done in a 6-year period within the constraints that the city has in terms of staff capacity, budget, all of those other kind of things. So implementation of the actions by the city requires, funding and adequate staffing. We'll be talking about those. The actions should really reflect those considerations so that taken together, they're achievable. And remember that the city can still explore actions outside of the HPS. What if the city has an action in HPS that it can't implement over the next 6 years? Well, there will be a process that the city will go through with the Department of Land Conservation and Development to discuss the reasons that the action isn't implementable and potentially select another action or actions, if that's appropriate, to address that same unmet housing need. So my guess, because none of us have ever, done a full cycle of a housing production strategy, and many of the rules around housing production strategies are new. My guess is that most cities are going to at some point end up in discussion with the state about actions that aren't achievable. Some cities may well come and say, we'd like to substitute this action in, or we're looking for some other help. So just recognize that this is an action plan that will happen over 6 years. Councilor Dunwell.
Thank you. One question that I have not seen addressed yet, is there a minimum number of actions that we're required to deliver?
No, there is no minimum, and there is, you have to address certain topic areas, either in your existing policies or in your new actions.
And the consequences of not meeting the requirements of the HPS?
Well, if you don't meet the requirements of the HPS, all right, once you've submitted your HPS, DLCD will do a review of it, and it'll either accept your HPS or it will send your HPS back to you with things that need to be changed. If the city never meets the requirements of the HPS, I think it's really a question from DLCD what the consequences are. I haven't seen that happen yet.
And has anyone from DLCD provided us with any guardrails for expectations of what the categories that must be met? I'm assuming that's what we're working under already, correct?
Yes. Give me one moment, and we've got that essentially in the memorandum. I apologize for showing you my messy screen. But these categories here, affordable home ownership, affordable rental housing, increasing housing stability, increasing housing choice, especially for federal and state protected classes, wider range of housing locations to access greater housing opportunity, addressing fair housing issues, and addressing homelessness. Those are the categories, and that's why we've included this table here.
And we must touch every one of those categories.
So Beth, if I added something in here too, real quick.
Mhm.
I think it's important that the rules say, at least in my reading of the rules, that it's actions in the HPS and other actions that we're undertaking as a city. So this is why we've included some information in here kind of on our existing ongoing actions, along with the new actions. So I think it's a little bit of both. Beth, other
Yeah.
insights you might have?
I think it is both. I was trying to evolve an answer to what if you didn't address one of these sets of actions at all? Would there be problems? I would imagine that there would be. It's a little hard for me to speak for DLCD when I don't have experience from which to speak for. Nobody does because this is also new.
Oh, and one final question. Beth, are you, as you're consulting with some of the other cities, are you seeing that they're in a similar path as we are? Are we ahead, behind, in the middle of the pack? Can you give us a temperature?
Well, of course, we've got much bigger cities that are doing different things and smaller cities that are perhaps doing less. I could best compare Wilsonville in a lot of ways with Milwaukee. We did their housing production strategy last year. They're about the same size approximately. And they have they're at a different place in their discussions of things like equity and that kind of thing than Wilsonville is. But I would say you guys are in a really similar places in a lot of ways. Your challenges and your opportunities have been things more like, Frog Pond, that kind of thing, whereas their challenges and opportunities are a little different than yours. So, Counselor, I see cities struggling in a similar way. And some cities are struggling more. Wilsonville has done more than some cities, done less than other cities. I think the challenge ends up becoming when you see some of the cities that are doing a lot less, how do you get to fairness and equity across the region? And in a lot of ways, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, the ONA, which is just beginning to, be implemented, that's the way you do that. So the next time that you do your housing capacity analysis, you'll have a forecast that's from the ONA, that's by income level, that reflects things about Wilsonville, and say West Linn will also have, I don't know if it's a similar forecast, but they'll certainly have the same buckets and the same considerations for how much housing needs to be affordable at different levels. And so I think that is the mechanism by which you start over time to get more regional equity.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions before we go on and start chatting about some of the actions?
So Beth, on that prior slide, I did have a couple points I wanted to expand on here, just to provide some additional context to what we mean when we talk about funding availability, adequate staffing, and what it means for the timeline of this document and kind of the accountability and expectations we have for when we select an action to put in this document. And so when we move into the next couple slides, you'll see we've got some initial draft recommendations based on our conversations and based on this perspective. This is certainly where we're hoping to get your feedback in this meeting today. But I know not everybody in this group is as aware of some of these kind of details and what we've done and where we're at sort of from a funding and staffing standpoint. And so, just wanting to share a little more about that there. So in terms of funding availability, you'll notice in the memo that some of the actions identify, how much funding is required, right? Is this something that we're doing in the course of ongoing work that the city would already be doing? Is this something that requires a funding incentive in order, to really get off the ground and have it be an action that is effective? And so, we're looking at it through the lens of what degree of funding does the city need to offer to be able to support an action? Right now, the housing actions we've done have really been done either as part of planning projects where we get some grant funding to fund that work, or it's been things where the city council has made a choice to take funds and support projects. So our transit-oriented development project we have going on right now, the city council made some choices to help offset, subsidize some of the SDCs for the project, as well as donating land. And so, you know, those are financial choices the city has made. But what we don't have as a city is really anything from a funding source standpoint outside of the general fund. And so we have to be mindful when we think about actions of, you know, that level of financial support is needed. And, you know, do we need to actually start some other revenue stream here that can help support future actions? And if so, you know, how long might that take and what can and can't be done in a 6-year period? So likewise, we've also identified for each of these actions staffing and whether or not we anticipate that the project could be undertaken with current staff levels or staff expertise versus needing additional, more experienced staff to be able to really start getting a housing program going. And so, you know, some of the projects, again, that we've been doing have been things where, you know, other city staff have jumped in and managed projects, not necessarily from that place of expertise on housing as a whole. But, you know, really, if we want to start talking about having a housing program, this is where that housing specialist kind of kicks in. And so thinking about the actions that either require that level of expertise or that additional staffing versus those that can be done by current staff is an important consideration, because even if we were to create a position, we don't know how long it is before that position can be funded, that position comes online and trained, and then at that point, which of the actions can that housing specialist take on? And so that's important context here. We're not starting from a place where we already have these systems going. But I think, you know, from our point of view, to be sustainable and successful in the long term, those are important considerations as we look at this menu of actions.
And since Councillor Dunwell asked the question, we will be talking to DLCD about some of the similar issues here. So we can bring that back, the understanding from that meeting back to the City Council. All right, so going on here. So you've been given a memo, which I can always put up on the screen if we want to instead of this, where you can refer to, you know, action A, action F, etc. So these are the actions grouped by whether staff is recommending keeping them, possibly keeping them, or removing them from the HPS. Kim, do you want to go through and talk about the reasons for suggesting removing actions from the HPS?
Yeah, sure. I can do that at a high level. I don't want to necessarily go into the weeds of everything, but I think also we want to use this as an opportunity that if there are questions, we can kind of talk through some of the considerations. There might be things where we're not thinking of, where, you know, our goals here are really, again, what is achievable in 6 years, and also what is satisfying that spread of different considerations that the state requires for us to include in the HPS, and looking at what is potentially most impactful. So I think in this first batch of what is highlighted in green, 2 things, and I'm not going to go through these necessarily in order, but I first want to highlight G and I. So developing the requirements for that housing specialist and establishing a construction excise tax. That really, both of these actions speak to that staffing and that funding stream. And so we think really that is a key foundation for any future work we think we want to do. And so because of that, we definitely think that those are things we want to move forward with. A and F on this list, you know, we know in terms of action A that this is the type of action that can be undertaken through some of the planning division's ongoing work program, particularly around maintaining our comprehensive plan. And we do have the sense that there might be some land use designations out there in the city where we think this could apply. And so what that potentially does is provide the opportunity for additional housing units. And because this is a housing production strategy, that becomes an important consideration because it's thinking about future places where we can grow our housing supply. Action F, which speaks to accessible design, I think, oftentimes this is not a topic that really comes to the forefront of people's minds until they are in a situation where housing, for whatever reason, is no longer as accessible as you might think it is when you're able-bodied. And really thinking about some of the fair housing goals that we have, and particularly thinking about the needs of aging populations, desire to age in place, as well as we've documented, people who have an array of disabilities who also need housing. How can we think about some of the requirements that we've adopted in our new urban growth areas like Frog Pond East and South, and maybe apply those more broadly throughout the city? Really looking at creating some standards to increase that accessible housing supply. And then lastly, the preservation of affordable rental housing. This looks at your existing housing stock and, how do you ensure continued affordability? We do know that there is one project within the city of Wilsonville that has tax credits that will expire in the next 6 years. And so for those that don't work in the affordable housing space, the tax credits are a key piece of allowing for housing development to provide continued ongoing affordability to people making incomes at anything like 80% and below AMI. And so we think this is going to be an issue that the city needs to look at either from a policy standpoint, or if we do have the funds, perhaps something with more of a financial incentive, but at the very least, looking at steps to ensure that this supply of affordable housing stock that currently exists is not lost. And we also have a couple in the maybe category, and these are items that we think, because they don't require additional housing expertise, that we could also undertake. I think it's a matter of making sure we're reaching an achievable amount of housing actions. But these are a couple of items that would be dealt with through our development code and or development review process that could have an impact both on the variety of housing as well as the review process for how you entitle a housing project. These seem to be the ones kind of rising to the top. In terms of the 4 actions at the bottom of the existing staff column, action D, while an interesting idea and is something that we've included in our Frog Pond Housing Code, the actual impact on housing production is likely not that high. And so while it is something we could do, we don't know that the impact is going to be that widespread. The scaled SDCs is really interesting. For those who don't follow land use law that extensively, there was a Supreme Court decision that came down within the past year that affects things like impact fees, or as we refer to them in Oregon, system development charges. And it doesn't say you can't have these types of fees, but it really gets into methodologies and tying the impact of the development to the fee that you're charging and making sure there's some kind of rational basis behind that. Our city attorney has weighed in on this, and based on what she's kind of observed and heard, suspects that there could be legal challenges to this type of scaled SDC approach that potentially makes this something that might not hold up going forward. And so I think given that legal uncertainty and knowing that it is a more complicated issue, we don't necessarily see prioritizing this. We kind of would, let's see how this shakes out in other cities before we try to adopt something that might not work. The last 2 really get more to funding and infrastructure. And I think particularly the last one, we know it's important. It's also something to agree that we are kind of continuing to be engaged in. And so in terms of an identifiable action, it's important. I don't know that we felt like continued advocacy is going to necessarily result in the same, increased number of housing units or housing production in that same sense. So then the other batch of actions on the right side of the screen, these are really just the actions that do require that housing specialist that, we think they're important. We do question the viability of implementing them until we have additional funding and additional staffing. And so beyond that, I'm happy to answer any other questions. I think we're really looking at key feedback on the inclusion or exclusion of some of these items. But then secondarily, if we do find ourselves fortunate enough to get a housing specialist on board before the end of this 6-year period, and we want to get moving on things, which of these items on the right actually is the most important? Because there's nothing that says that we can't start work on something just because it's not in this document. And so I do think we'd like to have that feedback as well.
And it may be that any of these actions that you're putting off, if they become more plausible later, could be something that you bring into your HPS at the midpoint check-in.
Yeah, exactly. We want to, I think, big picture, set ourselves up for success. We know that, as Beth noted, there is some uncertainty as we are navigating a newer process. But I think we want to take a, reasonable approach, knowing that kind of in the constraints in which we operate in this HPS, it feels a little more difficult to be aspirational, and we want to acknowledge that.
So Caroline, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I just wanted to comment that I thought your summary of actions, the Exhibit 1, was really helpful, especially the column where you had the highlight on impact on housing and the staff and the funding required. And so when I was going through the evaluation, I tried to highlight those to see which ones would have the most impact, like the biggest bang for our buck. I like the idea of the renewal district, but we're trying to, possibly get a renewal district funding for Town Center and maybe Basalt Creek. And so I not real favorable about the housing just because of the competing interests and trying to balance it and thinking about how would the public perceive if we're just, saying renewal districts everywhere. So those are my thoughts to start the discussion.
Andrew.
Hi there. So again, I'm new, so coming in cold, but I think that these priorities with the actions are really good. And as Counselor mentioned, getting really the bang for your buck, really good priorities of what to focus on. In particular, I really like the identification of preservation of affordable housing, of existing affordable housing. That's been really a sea change in our industry and priority in the state in the past year. When the federal LIHTC program started, it was a 30-year affordability period. That's changed in Oregon, but what that means is there's a lot of projects that are really now starting to kind of hit that clock. So really commend that, really being able to identify that. That's often kind of forgotten with the new construction, and the focus on that is the preservation. And then one thing to think about with preservation as well, especially when it's a smaller city and there might only be 1 or 2 traditional regulated affordable housing in the area, is to also think of preservation when it's kind of an aging, currently market, kind of naturally occurring affordable housing is the term, to think about those properties as well and ways to be able to look at rehabs and other components that wouldn't necessarily displace tenants. So again, I think this is a really good list and I commend the work so far.
And just to be clear, I believe that item N focuses on income restricted affordable housing, not necessarily naturally occurring affordable housing, because they're two different types of actions. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would add, I think that is a really good point. What we've seen just based on the age of Wilsonville, I think this is a good one to keep in the back pocket in our minds going forward. A lot of our housing stock is fairly newer. We are a younger city. But that being said, every year that goes on, that housing stock gets older. And I think, what might not seem like a big, a big source of preserving potentially more affordable housing opportunities could become that in the future. So I think that might be something we want to just think about and keep our eye on.
And so, Kim, we could include in the recommendations for future consideration section, things you're not adopting in the HPS, but you want to not lose sight of, is looking at preservation of naturally affordable housing. So naturally occurring affordable housing. Eric?
Yeah, I forget if we talked about this specifically before, but for locations where infrastructure is needed, I worked in the past with a local jurisdiction to do a CDBG application. So the nexus of affordable housing and development provided access to funds. Sounds like something, yeah, if you have a housing specialist or whatever, if it's posted online, but something you guys could do on the side, perhaps, or for later.
And honestly, that may be quite obvious in looking at however town center redevelops, and something I think the city may be doing naturally. But again, it could be included in the recommendations. Councillor Dunwell?
Thank you. If this continues to, I continue to struggle with items M and items O not being included, either or both on the actions. And I understand that we have a gap in staff, and there are costs to both of those. And yet, I want to make sure when this is presented to council that those may be more on the aspirational side. But given the fact that are we trying to race our way to the bottom to build more rental housing? Or are we trying to philosophically increase the number of individuals who can own homes and provide them vehicles to own homes, and whether it's their first home or whatever it may be, because we know that is one of the single greatest accumulation of generational wealth. And by missing that, any type of home buyer in just focusing on just rental in everything that we're recommending, I believe that there's a gap there. I know that that's much more difficult to achieve, but I want to make sure that we don't forget it. Wilsonville already has 50% of our residents are already renters, and the greatest benefit, from a monetary standpoint from rentals are the REITs and the private equity funds and whoever those landowners are and the owners of those facilities. I want to make sure that we continue to look at aspirationally creating a model, and maybe outside of this, Beth, but creating a model for allowing those individuals to be able that need that first down payment, or and maybe that's where this the community land trust comes in. Other elements that we can bring into this to make that at least on the horizon. It may not be able to happen within this task force, but I don't want it to be lost.
And so to that, I think I can genuinely promise that those kind of things, those three things that you mentioned right there, would I imagine, it's not my HPS, but I would imagine I'd propose putting it in the recommended, future considerations if it's not one of the actions in the HPS.
Okay.
Eric.
Yeah, sorry. Does the city have a Holti type program already?
No, the city isn't using Hulti. Very few cities use Hulti simply because it's so complicated, and making sure that you have affordability passed on past the first ownership is very complicated. I know that in Portland, at some point, even I think it's true now, they don't track Hulti past the first owner.
Can you define that term, please?
It's a homeowners limited equity, blah, blah, blah. It's a tax incentive. Very much like something like the multi-unit property tax incentive is about multifamily rental housing. Hulti really supports homeowners who qualify, so lower income homeowners. Eric, did you have something to add on to that, or should we let?
Sorry, you responded pretty much saying it's just a tool, but you have to set it up
Oh
for
yeah,
homeowners, for first-time homebuyers.
and it's rather complicated comparatively. It's telling that only Portland has implemented it. So
It may be complicated, but is it doable? City our size.
I am doubtful. Without more staff, we can look at Hulti more closely.
It's a fair answer, Beth. No, that's a fair answer, because I think that there's a huge delta on the staff side.
And honestly, some of the other things that you've got here may well help more people, including for home buyers.
Thank you.
Maria?
Yeah, I think Counselor Katie, you echoing a lot of what you're sharing. I always use this example of a affordable housing community out in Woodburn called Nuevo Amanecer. That growing up in the area, we would always see that as like the hope. If you make it to Nuevo Amanecer, it's not a forever, but it's the pathway to. And so seeing the support for homebuyer assistance program, again, I know that we can't do all the things at the same time, but those things really do make a difference. And I've myself seen what it can be like to have a place where there is hope, but there's action and opportunities within that, because it's not forever. And then I think a lot of the opportunities that are coming up in Wilsonville in terms of workforce, some of which we've discussed in other groups with some of you before, and what that's going to mean for the demographics, the people that are coming in, and looking at, now, the Latino community is, I think, 11 point some percentage. But I always say that because of the location of Wilsonville, it's also, there's a lot of towns, right? A lot of the really small towns surrounding it. So echoing a lot of what you're saying. And I myself personally have seen the difference that it makes to really creating pathways to home ownership, which, prosperity, economic development, all of the things. And Wilsonville is a place, I think, that can do so much of that. And then I think I also wanted to share that with the housing specialist position, it says partners NA, and then reading through the description of how it would happen. I think and I think you do mention on there, like connecting with homeowners, connecting with a lot of different people, conducting a lot of outreach. I think there is a lot of really good potential to have partnerships with organizations like nonprofits, let's say, or have them support in leading some of this outreach. Because one, this is people on the front line doing the work, working on there, and it would be really beneficial to get that insight in developing the position or description. And then additionally, even in the Wilsonville Transit-Oriented Development, Muela, we saw the difference of having our organization do the community outreach in the volume of people that showed up and offered insights, versus not having that somebody that has already trust built in within the community. So just really echoing what you said, Counselor, and I wanted to add those thoughts that there is opportunity for partnership, and it makes an even greater impact when these are people that have trust already and frontline experience in working with renters, affordable housing communities, all of the targets that we're talking about.
So Maria, I believe what you were saying is in developing that position, engaging with those partners to say, hey, this is the position we're thinking about. Do you have input on, what the requirements would be? That kind of thing, the position description, essentially. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Rachel.
Yeah. So I'm a bit new to this position and filling in for someone in these meetings, so I'm just getting up to speed. But before this, I worked as a land use planner for the city of Lapine, and we had a lot of interest in specifically affordable housing for multifamily units. And well, I think that this has done a really good job of prioritizing, especially without a dedicated housing specialist position. I think, item J, the identifying locations where infrastructure is needed. Infrastructure costs can be such a big hurdle to development, especially for affordable housing, that we saw it kill some projects, especially in Lapine, because Lapine, like Wilsonville, is growing, and so our infrastructure was having trouble keeping up with that need. I know City of Pasco and Washington. It might be interesting to look. They did a Broadmoor area master plan, and they funded a lot of that infrastructure through TIF, tax increment financing. I don't know if that's allowed in Oregon or not.
That's item H.
Huh?
That's item H, urban renewal. That's a tax increment financing.
Yeah, so that they were able to bring kind of infrastructure to that area through that funding mechanism. So yeah, I think all of these are important, but I think cost of infrastructure can be such a big hurdle to overcome. So
Kim, can you talk a little bit about how the city is handling this? Because I know one of the reasons that it fell into the remove list was that, yeah, city's kind of already doing this. Is there a there to this action? And you're muted, just so you know.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to type some notes as we go, so I don't want everybody to hear type in the background. Yeah, I think that really does capture it. Historically, Wilsonville, we've been very mindful of ensuring that development as it occurs is supported by infrastructure. So when we do master planning, particularly for our new urban areas, we are very deliberate in planning out what that infrastructure need is and looking at, the availability of tools we have to fund it. So, particularly in our latest new urban area, we did an infrastructure funding plan as part of that master plan adoption. We've got SDCs, the tool that every city has, but we often find with newer areas that you need more than that. So we've actually tried a couple of different approaches over the years, whether that be supplemental fees or looking at smaller scale urban renewal. We've looked at a lot of different things, but I think some of it is we already kind of know where our needs are. And so as we talked through this action more, I think we kind of just thought, well, this is stuff that we do on an ongoing basis. We are on the record and completely agree that the cost of infrastructure is a big limiting factor, and the continued increase in these costs becomes a limiting factor when it comes to development coming online more quickly. And so yeah, I think one of the reasons that this didn't rise to the top, because there was an element of, well, we're kind of already doing this, and so as written, is this really kind of ongoing? Like, what value is this action adding? Because that's, I think, an important piece for us, is we want to be sure that the actions we include in this document do add value to the work we're already doing.
Councillor Dunwell?
Yes, I'd like to speak just a little bit about your terminology, because I'm really starting to key on that. The descriptive nomenclature, evaluate, encourage, develop, establish, support. You know where I'm going with this, Beth. Support is really easy to achieve.
Yep.
Develop is not.
Yep.
Encourage is very easy to achieve. Is there a reason that we use the softer nomenclature and definitions as opposed to others? Because quite frankly, if support home buyer assistance programs, I'm going to keep going back to it,
Yeah.
It's very friendly. It says this is more aspirational. We can tie into it. And what is the criteria that we have to show that we're supporting it versus implement a rental housing inspection program?
Honestly, this has come up in most of the HPSs. And we're, I think, going to have to move into different verbs on this. This has been an issue that DLCD has brought up with nearly all of the housing production strategies. How does a city council agree to an action that won't happen for 6 years and saying, we're going to do this action? That's really hard for a city council to say. In the HPS, we're going to have to clearly identify what the action is. So what does it mean to support? It means tracking these things. It means partnering with these agencies. It may mean, doing these things that one in particular, when you're talking about LIHTC expiring. That one in particular may mean doing, some active action to help the LIHTC not expire, to get new LIHTC. Support a home buyer assistance program. That probably means, either setting up your own home buyer assistance program and funding it, or working with some partner who's got a home buyer assistance program where they'll work in Wilsonville, or they do work in Wilsonville, and helping fund it. So some of that language is going to have to get sharper.
I think so, because if I were to go in and start to develop what the benchmarks that we would be measured against,
yeah,
that sounds more like establish rather than support.
That is an
develop rather than support. So are we going to do that throughout this task force, or are you going to go back with your red pen and refine some of these?
Well, I think we're going to get city council direction on which of these to go with, and sharpen those ones up, and include monitoring activities. So what are the outcomes you're looking for? What are, number of units built, number of acres rezoned, that kind of thing. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
That will be done before you being the city council adopts the HPS.
Okay, and you're presenting this in a work session first. Two work sessions.
We're talking on February 20th with the city council, and then there are meetings beyond that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Eric?
Yeah, I guess hearing all this, I want to echo what Maria said, if you have a specialist, I guess how realistic is that to happen if that is the primary goal? How many of these things kind of fall under that individual, like lending capacity to explore and define these in a better way? So is that the most realistic first step? And then getting removing or whatever, if there are notes, first things for that individual to work on, right? I mean, I don't think you would need a highly experienced individual if you have staff experience that they can lean on, et cetera. But for the home ownership thing, right? Outside of taking in little pieces of funding for individual acquisitions of homes with particular buyers, there's home buyer programs throughout the state already set, right? So no need to recreate, but anyway, partnerships, seems like there's a lot there, and I'll be done.
I certainly think building on your existing partnerships and not creating something new, if it doesn't have to be created new, is smart. Things like item K and item L, expanding land banking and partnering with the Community Land Trust, those can be very time consuming. And that's certainly something that you would need a housing specialist, some additional staff person to do. If the city council looks at the home buyer assistance programs and decides that part of your construction excise tax, part of what you want to target that to, because you have a portion of that you can choose discretionary how you're spending, We want to do that with homebuyer assistance programs with existing organizations. That is certainly something that the council could direct. I'm hoping I'm not overstepping my boundaries here a little bit too much, Kim. Councillor Dunwell?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate this. I would actually like to receive some feedback from Lee from Wilsonville Community Sharing regarding the rental housing inspection program. And I know that is, really, that is, quite far out there for us to be able to achieve that through this program. But I would like to at least keep that on radar. And Lee, you deal with so many of our rentals and so many of our folks that are in our marginalized populations. What are you seeing from them as far as quality of the rental units that they're living in?
Poor quality, to be honest with you. I think I spoke at this our last meeting, the mold issues in quite a few of the apartment complexes here. We've had a lot of displaced families because of the mold and just general repairs and upkeep. We've had, people with no working oven for, months because their landlord hasn't gotten around to it. Heating systems, peeling paint, little things that, us as homeowners it's an easy fix. But when you're relying on somebody else's time and money to come in and try to repair something, it doesn't get done. And so we've had a lot of frustration with some of our clients dealing with that. They can't afford to move because they have a lease. And what is that going to do anyway? Their rent is so high. They've already established, they've already paid their fees. So they start over, but everything that they still have in that apartment. So we haven't gotten a lot of good feedback on the apartment situation. Some of the newer apartments, we hear very, very nice things. But then I've got feedback from some of the newer apartments that there's bad rat infestations that they can't get a hold of. Get a handle on. So I, for one, would like to see some sort of inspections happening.
And I really don't want to lose sight of that. I think because 50% of our population is in a rental property, and I don't want to find us in a situation as a city where it's a race to the bottom, where landlords are not maintaining the upkeep. We don't have a rental inspection program as a priority for our city, and it may be outside the purview of this task force and what we're doing here. And yet, by the same token, there has to be accountability, especially with such a significant percentage of our population in rentals. And I hear it all the time. And I know, Lee, that you probably hear it more than me times 10 or 50. And so it is something that I understand what the state is requiring us to do, but if you can't keep your own house clean, you're going to have a problem. And the problem might be tomorrow, but we're deferring the inevitable.
Eric.
Again, I'm hearing all these things like implement an inspection program, right? I mean, I don't know what the recourses are. If there's legal recourses, you're filing formal complaints against an owner or whatever, but how much of these things could all fall under a general purview of this potential extra staff to really see things move forward, right? That just, you guys could have a home ownership partner that's in the city and does things on certain occasions or whatever it may be, and all these are just limited levels of coordination or setting up a hotline. So
I mean, a rental housing inspection program is rather complicated and certainly needs staff to staff it. That's not something that you can partner out, I don't think.
Well, right. I mean, I know there's a significant number of housing advocacy agencies all throughout Portland, right, that are independently funded. I don't know the details. I'm just
So you're
pondering it.
saying contracting with one of them as an option?
right, all these things potentially could fit under, one individual that takes on this list and is in charge of trying to see, well, what is the realistic capacity of the city through partnerships, through nonprofits, through what are jurisdictional regulations that just need to be identified, a notice to or however it might be, right? Leveraging the other agencies throughout the state. But that leveraging would all come from that housing specialist.
So Eric, I think we're agreeing with you that housing specialist, their work program would certainly include items K through O and whatever else. I think the reason for not including them in the HPS is because of the uncertainty of being able to afford and hire that housing specialist in 6 years in such time for them to actually have time to do work. So in other words, if the city was able to hire them in 5 years, then they might be able to set up, 1 or 2 of these programs in that last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I have no idea what the capacity is financially for hiring the individual, and I'm not advocating that you should change the allocation of the items here on your list. It just,
okay.
Yeah, it seems like one would beget the other, and however you present that to your interested parties, all arrows kind of point to one piece, G.
I think that's exactly the discussion that we've been having with staff, and staff's been having with each other, is that, G really unlocks some more major things. I mean, honestly, G and I, the construction excise tax, those are really key. I want to invite Jennifer, if you have any comments. I think you're unmuted.
Yeah, I've been appreciating the conversation around the housing specialist because that was where my thoughts were going in reviewing the package beforehand. So thank you for that. And I understand now, based on your comment just a moment ago, why the language develop requirements for a housing specialist is kind of squishy to because that's that is foundational to acquiring the housing specialist, which is foundational to everything else. So that I want to echo the importance of that role. One question I have, and it may not belong in a housing production strategy, but is there any anti-displacement work that we need to do? Because I'm trying to remember the name of the session we had at the Planning Commission before we had the main session. We had feedback from community members, and we heard about stories about the displacement concerns that they have, and the struggles when they get displaced and the costs of avoiding homelessness. So my question is there room for any anti-displacement work in a production strategy?
There certainly is. I would say item N and item F are partially anti-displacement.
Okay.
So accessible design so that people can stay in their homes even if their physical abilities change. And then preservation of rental housing is certainly an anti-displacement strategy. And I can flip to the memorandum if we want. You may have policies already that are listed in there that are anti-displacement policies.
But what I learned is that we do have community resources, but available to people that might be facing displacement, and connecting them with those resources. Would that be something that would this housing specialist would be able to do, or do you think it'd be on their scope?
I feel like I'm speaking out of turn here.
I'll take it, Beth. So I think, some of what we think about when we think of this housing specialist is really an evolution of one of our actions that we have not completed from the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan, which was, I think we called it a housing liaison. I think as this conversation has evolved, it almost feels clearer to me what that person's role would be. But a large part of it was just when we went through that process, a lot of the feedback we got was that there's a lot of either other governmental partners or nonprofit partners that do a lot of work that we don't necessarily need or want to duplicate as a city, particularly a city of our size. So one of the pieces to that recommendation was really creating a person that could serve as a sort of one-stop shop around housing related inquiries, both, doing some more technical work, but then also making those connections and growing those connections too. Because one of the things that I took away from that meeting back in December was just, I think my own lack of awareness, because we don't have those conversations a lot about what kind of resources are available, even at the county level, right? Like we're a little bit far away from Oregon City and the offices out there. And, people, I don't know how widely publicized a lot of that information is, particularly in our community. How, certainly Lee, you probably are one of the people doing that work, but, from like a city point of view, we don't even have really a lot of that information available on our website. So a simple step is just, providing education about where people can get assistance and access those resources and really further grow those partnerships. We don't have anybody currently here on city staff within our building that is sort of tasked with doing that. And so that was seen as being part of that role. So I would certainly think, the housing specialists, I guess they won't do it all, but as we think about what it is that they're doing and what the minimum requirements are, I think that's probably a very important consideration to have.
And I will mention that one of the things that will be in the HPS is more extensive discussion about partnerships, because a number of you have brought those up and how important those are, and naming the partners we can name right now. Caroline?
You kind of just said what I was thinking. I think it would be really important in the plan to identify what Clackamas County does. Just identify the resources and maybe have some contact information, and same with the other partners that we work with. Because that could save people a lot of hassle if they knew that there were already some services available.
And so that's something that I think the HPS itself wouldn't go into a lot, but I think that's a good recommendation to have, but certainly naming different partner organizations and different resources that we know of. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a name and a brief description.
We can look at that. So are there other comments on the exclusions or anything?
I do have one quick comment. I appreciate what Eric mentioned about housing specialists being really critical to everything, multiple other elements that could fall underneath it. Would it make sense to restructure this so that those would fall under? I know that we're talking about developing requirements, but as you're getting ready to present this to council to talk about the interrelationships between one and the others.
We have that somewhat in the memo. We could do that more, and I'd want to hear a little more of what you'd like to see there.
Well, you've got a limited time in the work session. I would just want to make sure that that was clear so that no one would key specifically on one of those items that's actually directly related to the hiring of a housing specialist.
Okay.
So yeah, and Councilor Dunwell, I think, obviously the attachment that was in this packet will be an attachment to that staff report for the work session. I think the context that I can provide council in the staff report as an overview, having this conversation here, I think really kind of speaks to sort of, at least in my mind, how it all the actions sort of flow from one another. And as Beth mentioned, G and I are really kind of foundational. And so really describing the role they have and then how the other recommendations fit in, I think I can look to lay that out in a way that makes sense.
Maybe we, I don't know, draw a picture, have a flow diagram or something like that.
And the only reason I bring this up is because typically when those PowerPoints are brought up, they're not directly related point by point to the staff report itself. And sometimes it can get a little muddy. for especially with 3 new members of council who aren't familiar with the work of the task force, and they'll be coming into this somewhat green, to make sure that maybe just a consideration that you present the deck, your presentation out prior, so that there can be an understanding of the connections between the staff report and the presentation itself. There's a lot of information to share out here, and there will definitely be a lot of questions.
Thank you.
And Kim, I'm happy to work with you on looking at how we can make that as easy as possible for the new council.
Yeah, I think we can definitely, some graphics might be really helpful. We'll see what we can do.
Thanks.
Jennifer?
Along those lines, I think it could be really compelling that when this conversation happens on City Council and this slide is discussed, that the actions requiring the housing specialist be called something different, be highlighted in a red color, like really draw attention that the housing specialist is very foundational to being able to pursue some of these other items. So that way it's not just, oh yeah, this is not as accessible. It's just to really bring that up to the forefront.
Fair point. Thank you.
Since I have y'all here, I do want to ask a question, because I'm hearing a lot of interest in these actions. I'm hearing a lot of interest in the housing specialist and the actions requiring the housing specialist. And so, given kind of in light of the second question on this slide, I don't know that we're necessarily looking for a rank prioritization, but I feel like what I'm hearing, in particular, L, M, and O are all seeming pretty important. Not that K isn't, but I haven't heard as much conversation around K. I think there's an interrelationship between L and M potentially. And so I want to put that out there, that I feel like that's what I'm hearing, and maybe just get a confirmation from the group that, yes, that sounds about right. No, Kim, you're totally off base. Just because I think that will, influence how we present this going forward in the HPS.
So, Eric?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like, K is capital intensive. So where do you get money to do that? And a third party or a nonprofit group is not generally going to be able to solve that for you, right? So like scale STCs, you already commented, not very applicable due to moving regulatory structures. But yeah, anything that like identifying locations or infrastructures, that's just identification, that all fits in. So it's like capital intensive or not partnerships. So yeah.
I will mention that oftentimes K is an entree to the L. So in other words, having that partnership with the Community Land Trust, how do you get them to build housing in your community? If you have land that you can contribute to the development of it, then that's a big advantage. And then if you also had some homebuyer assistance programs that could be channeled into the people potentially buying into the CLT, then that starts to put together something that's a little bit stronger. And if it's in an area, I'm just building up stuff, that let's say it's in an urban renewal district where some of the infrastructure has been dealt with, so that's not so expensive for the development. You can see how these things can stack together to create the opportunities for developing that kind of aspirational housing that Maria was talking about. And sometimes it takes a number of these things to stack together to get there.
Yeah, I guess so. Just like land banking is going to take a long time, right? Even if there's a housing specialist, they can notify partners that there's available land, right? I mean,
it doesn't have to be an official land bank. It could be, an opportunistic rezone, like you did with the transit center. But no, your point's very taken, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I agree generally with everything. For sure.
Commissioner Dunwell, Councilor Dunwell, I apologize.
That's okay. Thank you. I was commissioner last night at Willamette Intake Facility, so I forget what I do. So, question This is more for Maria and Beth. Beth, are you familiar with the project Maria is speaking to in Woodburn?
Not that particular one. I'm familiar with other community land trusts.
It would be very interesting as we're, at least beginning a journey. I want to be really careful about how I say this because there's no commitment, but at least beginning the journey to at least have some exploration. And I think that is why it's built into a description for a specialist, because they're the ones that can actually facilitate those conversations and help gather that understanding of some of these communities that have already been built, that and really look at the success rate of them.
So, I mean, the way I would suggest approaching it is talking with a couple of existing land trusts, like Proud Ground and Dev Northwest are the two that I hear quoted most frequently. I'm sure there are other land trusts that I'm just less familiar with, but they can often help provide those kind of examples of exactly what you're talking about.
And I think the issue we run into at the city of Wilsonville is our planning staff is already stretched.
That is the problem, yeah.
It is. They're already, thinly stretched with all of the projects that we have going on. So to ask them to undertake with the city council, it's not just because, oh, let's do this and they'll fix everything for us. There is a true need, an evaluation of a need that needs to be discussed.
So I'm not sure what you're suggesting specifically. Is it something to do as part of the HPS, or is it?
No, I think it's a discussion that happens within the city council during the work session.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I think it's outside of anything that you present, but just for a heads up for you, as that presentation goes on, it may very well be something that I bring forward, that we already have staff that is quite thinly stretched.
Maybe one of the things that you want to do at some point in the future is see if one of the land trusts will come and talk to you.
Exactly. Thank you.
Certainly. Kim? I see Caroline.
Barry. Yes, let her ask her question.
Oh, okay. So the thing that keeps going through my mind as we're talking about this, especially when you brought up the comments about the community land trust, I think that in our plan, we really need to define what the problem is, because I think a lot of the city citizens don't understand there is a problem. And so we need to have a really clear description of what the problem is. And if we can use numbers, that would be even better.
That is chapter 2 of the housing production strategy.
Yeah.
After a very short chapter 1 introduction.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, Councilor Barry, the data is there, and I completely agree with you. And we will make sure that that's front and center when we make that presentation too.
Yeah, well, I know we have the data. I just think we need to get it expressed so that the public can see it and understand it.
So, Councilor Dunwell, I don't know that we imagine presenting that data again to the City Council on February 20th. Because
will it be in the supporting documents?
It could be.
That's what I was thinking. I don't necessarily think it needs to be part of your presentation, but I think that we know that we have some citizens that really pore over the data. And to make that data available to them, we want to be, really thoughtful from a time standpoint and being very efficient with it. You don't want to just do a data dump, but.
So what we might do is include the PowerPoint from one of the prior.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay, all right.
It's exactly what I was thinking. I've already seen it. I know I've already seen it from you. So,
okay.
Yeah.
That is completely doable from my perspective.
And already done.
Yeah, indeed.
You can do that as an attachment. So
great.
Well, Beth, I know we have one more slide, but I feel like we've sort of been discussing the question on there. But just to circle back up, I think we've heard a lot of feedback about the implementation considerations, but this is another step, I think also that just for your awareness, when we come back to you next time, it really will be with that draft document and these actions kind of built out. And so I think when we have that draft too, that'll be a good opportunity to see everything that's there, all the words that we end up using, making sure that the words are consistent with what DLCD is expecting from us, and that, you know, we're pretty clear on what the actions are. You know, are we exploring? Are we committing? You know, we'll make sure we're solid on that. But, you know, certainly there's an opportunity to add and provide comment at that point. But that being said, as we kind of do the sharpening, I think any additional feedback beyond what is already in the memo is helpful for us to have. I think we might have talked about a lot of it already, so we have good feedback. We appreciate that. Thank you.
So I'm going to hop over to next steps, which happen to be on the first slide. So we're going to continue our refinement of the actions and compile the HPS. We have a city council meeting to discuss approximately what we discussed this evening on February 20th. We are going to be talking with some Latino organizations to discuss implementation of the potential actions. This goes to, you know, potential opportunities for partnerships, et cetera, but also the partners and how you implement the actions can really benefit disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, communities of color, that kind of thing. We've got an open house and then the last task force meeting, and beyond that, the city council, of course, and planning commission work sessions and adoption. So that's what's coming up. Are there any final questions or comments? Then Kim, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Beth, for walking us through that, and thank you all to the group for giving us feedback. I think this is really helpful to, at least for me, to feel like we're not entirely off base here. Because, you know, it's always intimidating to be like, we have this great list, you know, these are all great ideas, but we know we can't do everything in 6 years. So where do we start, you know, kind of pulling back? And I think we tried to be thoughtful and, you know, really hearing particularly the support from this group around that housing specialist, I think backs up what we felt we already knew. And so I think really telling that story as we move this forward, you know, I appreciate all the feedback you've given, because I think that really will provide our city council with the context they need to absorb, you know, what these actions mean, you know, both for the actions that are actually going in here, but, you know, really thinking kind of long-term, even beyond these 6 years. So we're not doing this in a vacuum. And so we appreciate all of that feedback. We don't know exactly when our next task force meeting will be, but probably I'm going to guess if we stay on our current schedule, that would be probably late March, early April timeframe, but we will follow up when we know more. But in the meantime, if there are any other ideas or questions you have that come to mind after this meeting, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and let me know. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Councillor Dunwell to conclude our meeting.
Thank you all for your participation today. Every perspective was heard, and I think that it's helped us to get to a much better understanding and a much more thoughtful process. So again, appreciate all your contribution. I would encourage all of you to, we'll send out an alert after the council meeting if you don't feel like watching it on YouTube, so at least you can see that work session as we prepare for the our next task force meeting, so that you can get an idea of what the feedback was from the council during the work session to help us as we all move forward. But thank you, Beth, for all your great work on this, and Kim, and I know Dan and Miranda have also been very instrumental in moving this forward. So appreciate all of your volunteer time, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.